I've been going back and forth on whether or not to share this story. So I think I'm just going to go for it. So a few years ago, I was at a church, a group of lovely people, but we had our issues. And I was new here, and we had our first meeting of our brand new Justice and Equity team. And this church was not yet open and affirming. And I thought that was one of the first orders of the days we needed to deal with. And from all of the one-on-one meetings that I've had, coffee gatherings, conversations after church, I thought this was going to go through no problem. I thought we might have to touch base on a few, just basic educational matters as to why this is important. And as we talked about it in this group, folks started coming up with some very important logistical issues. All right, we got to talk about those things, right? And I thought, okay, we're counting the cost. Before you build something, you got to count the cost. And then, as they went on, this stopped seeming, and it became obvious, it was no longer about seeing what's at stake if we move forward. It was about trying to delay or avoid altogether. Well, Giuseppe, what about those people in the church who don't want us to be open and affirming? Now, for those who may be unfamiliar with this term, either in the room or online, well, I'm glad you know. This is like a very denomination-specific term. Some other groups call it something very different, right? So wherever you may be coming from, in the Disciples of Christ, where I was at, and in the United Church of Christ, this term means open towards everybody in the great rainbow of sex and gender identity, and affirming of that identity. Full stop, no exception, at all levels. That means when Giuseppe is getting interviewed for a new role, that position at an open and affirming church is also being considered for any LGBTQIA peers also interested in that church. When it's time to find some volunteers to work with the kids, when it's time to find worship leaders, all of it, readers, no exception. That's the way it should be. That's the way it's been here, right? And it's better because of it. I wouldn't be here otherwise, partially because of what I learned through this previous experience. It's tough. It's tough to change direction, especially when people keep bringing up the buts. And here was the kind of the flabbergasting thing for me. Ideologically, people were on board for this who made up the group. In their minds and in their hearts, they're like, oh yeah, I'm for this. It's just so-and-so, and if we lose so-and-so, they're a big tither, and we might have to close the church, and But I'm for it. I'm not like that bigoted person over there who I also love dearly with all my heart and never want to offend. And the result of this meeting was that the process eventually started, but it was delayed years. And honestly, if it wasn't for some of the LGBTQIA plus folks who came to the church, who risked vulnerability, who wanted to have relationship with us and be accepted, and not only that, but also challenge us, I don't think we would have got going. I don't think I could have preached a message that was going to melt those cautiously pragmatic hearts. And I think this is one of the great temptations we face. When we have setbacks in front of us, we're always tempted to choose the status quo. If it's a change, and it doesn't seem like it may be immediately pragmatic, we are forced to choose between political pragmatism and what is right. And there's different risks for that. And when we hit these setbacks, well, how do we move forward? How do we deal with setbacks? How do we, when we know with our deepest convictions that love and justice is leading us in a certain direction, that God is leading us in a certain direction, how do we deal with those barriers? One particularly difficult setback is failure. Hey, we tried it, and it didn't work. Right? That's hard. And this is something we've not seen much of in the book of Mark just yet. See, I'm coming back around to the text now. We've been getting a pretty steady stream of miraculous victories on the part of Jesus. Or he's teaching and people are like, that's incredible. This guy knows what he's talking about. We should listen to him. They only get like part of what he's saying, especially the disciples. They're like, seems good enough to me. Can I be in charge of everything? No. All right, cool, that's fine. We also don't see Jesus getting surprised very often in any of the Gospels. But in this story, before the beheading of John the Baptist, we actually get both things happening. We get failure and we get surprise. Jesus goes back to his hometown of Nazareth. He brings his 12 buddies with him, the disciples, and he preaches a stirring message. He's at his hometown synagogue, and the people are impressed by what he has to say. They're impressed by the message. But you know what they're not impressed by? The messenger. They know this guy. They saw him grow up. Even his family is unimpressed. And Jesus is cut to the core about this. He responds, in my translation, with amazement. That means he's surprised by the hardness of their hearts, by the lack of their faith. Now, this is a little confusing for us if we like combine all the gospel accounts together. We're like, Mary, though, surely, she's part of this too. Even Mary doesn't really get them. Failure. How do we deal with failure? Also, how do we deal with other people failing us? What do we do when the people that we grew up with can't see us for who we are, can't see the potential in us? What do we do when our own families don't believe in us? Many a would-be world changer, once they've encountered folks who don't believe in them, have just stopped altogether, right? That dream is done. It gets put up here, and I'm going to choose something pragmatic now. I got to be grounded. Have any of you had to deal with that? I'm not going to ask you to share anything vulnerable, just a hand. Yeah. Have you ever had your dreams or your hopes crushed because people didn't believe in you? It says in the text that the consequence of this is so severe, Jesus can't heal people. He's able to heal a few people, but not nearly as many as he normally is. And it's a curious text. He says it's because of their lack of faith, and I just wonder about that, what Mark means. Is it because Jesus is rattled? Is it a theological proposition by Mark that I don't really agree with? I don't know. I don't know. But the bottom line is, Jesus has been failed by the people who should be believing in him. And he's also failed to meet his own objective. His goal was that his message would be received in Nazareth, and it is not. What do we do with failure? Now, the interesting thing here is that Jesus actually chooses his boldest moment of ministry and trust up to this point. He commissions the 12 disciples to go out one by one, individually, into the surrounding communities and share his message of repentance. That means, turning from the toxic things in life. And to share healing with people. And he wants them to do this in the most vulnerable, dangerous way that they can. They can only bring the clothes on their backs, the shoes on their feet, and a handy-dandy walking stick. That means for each one of these disciples, they have to trust the communities that they're going to grant their basic needs. That's audacious. That's a bit absurd, right? It takes a lot of trust. It's bold. And the result of this is, because of their work sharing this message, the highest level of government in Judea learns about Jesus and his ministry. And that is when we encounter the story that Walter just read. While the disciples are out there risking their well-being on trusting the communities that they come across, we learn what's happened to John the Baptist. Now, we met John the Baptist in chapter 1. He's the peculiar, strange, but powerful individual who initiates Jesus into ministry. He provides a baptism, and God speaks in this moment. Jesus and John, their ministries are linked together. In a lot of ways, Jesus is both successor and one who goes considerably beyond the scope of what John was preaching. But that core of repentance, of turning from toxicity, that was central to John's message, and it's central to Jesus as well, right? And John, bold, camel hair wearing, cricket eating guy that he is bold. He calls out folks on their wrongdoing, society on their wrongdoing, but he also calls out the powerful people, which is dangerous. It's always dangerous to confront people in power with wrongdoing. And he says, hey, Herod, you cannot just claim anybody you want as yours. That includes your brother's wife. You can't just say, hey, I'm king. I get to have her now. By the way, he was called King of the Jews, if you're wondering where some of the friction's going to come later, right? Really, in Palestine, in this area, he's one of the most powerful people, just under Rome, right? And as powerful people often do when they're being criticized, he silences John by having him imprisoned. He locks him up, throws him in the dungeon. But he actually, interestingly, doesn't hate John. He respects John the Baptist, and he actually wants to hear what he has to say. And our text very nicely says that he was perplexed. I feel like that's a kind way of saying he was confused. John is talking, and he's like, I get like half of what you're saying, I've been there. And he still, like, he'll come and he'll visit John the Baptist and have this private audience with him. Very strange behavior for somebody that you silence, right? He knows that John's not done anything wrong, but he's not going to release John, at least not right now, because of his own ego. He can't have people bad-mouthing him, right? The status quo, got to preserve the status quo. So justice is halted. And then the king has a party. And he gets good and toasted. And his stepdaughter, his wife Herodias, by the way, what a strange couple name, right? Herod and Herodias. I once did a wedding. This does not matter at all. I shouldn't even do it. I once did a wedding for a Sam and a Sam. And I mean, it was a great wedding, but always perplexed me. Like, if I met a Giuseppe, would I don't know if I could. So he has this big party, and he tells his stepdaughter, because he enjoys her dance, her, as Walter put it, TikTok dance so much, he promises her, the moon. You can have anything up to half my kingdom. What a flex, right? He's doing this in front of all the people he gets to boss around. This is his inner circle. And so she goes and she talks to Herodias, her mom, and she says, hey, stepdad's saying I could have like anything, basically. What should I get? And she doesn't say, you should get a nice beach house. Have you considered Caesarea? It's real nice this time of year. She says, I'm still pretty angry at that John the Baptist guy that we just have locked up in that basement over there. I think you need to ask Dad for his head. Could you do that? And so, Herod, he's asked this in front of everybody. And what is the risk if he does the right thing here? And he says no. Well, now he looks like that guy who doesn't follow through with his promises. Now he can't really give her anything he wants. There's a limit to what he can give. Now he's choosing this guy who badmouthed him over his stepdaughter. You can't have that. And so, even though he doesn't want to, even though he doesn't hate John the Baptist, he has him beheaded immediately and has his head put on a silver platter and delivered to his stepdaughter, who then gives it to her mom. I know this is a gross story, and it's one that maybe we don't want to think about. I've not heard many sermons on it, at least in progressive churches, but it's an important one. Because this is a huge setback for Jesus and the ministry. That's why it's put here. This is a big setback. What happens now? What do we do when the people that we believe in can no longer continue their work? What do we do when the forces that we are in opposition to, who seek to harm us, have the day? The verses that follow this tell us that Herod is so guilt-stricken by all of this. It's like Poe's The Telltale Heart. And when he learns of Jesus' ministry, he is convinced Jesus is John the Baptist back from the dead. Jesus is John the Baptist reborn. Now, at this point, the disciples have returned. They've come back, and they've shared all of the wonderful things that happened, and they continue on. Jesus responds with continued faithfulness to the mission that God has given him. The disciples continue with faithfulness to this call that they also have received. And I think there's something in there for us. They continue on. We've been a part of movements that seem to be only as big as the personalities that are leading the charge. And then scandal strikes. Death comes. Retirement happens. And that can seem like an insurmountable setback. So what do we do when setbacks come? Will we still care about housing justice? Will we still care about supporting the lives of marginalized people when our neighbors in the media turn on us? Will we still care about LGBTQIA+ equity when hateful people come into this sacred space and proclaim their vitriol? Will we still care about black and brown people in Portland when protests are shut down by force? Will we still care when we encounter failure or even death of our loved ones, the people we believe in? Church, I think you already know the answers to this, right? I think you know the answers to this because you've had to deal with these things over the last 6 years. And from what I can see, when given the option between preserving a more friendly feeling status quo, escaping conflict, or continuing on, you've chosen to keep going. I think that matters. What I see in this church is that those things have caused deep and grievous wounds, but it's also strengthened your resolve. And I hope that's true, not just in the life of us as a church body, but I hope that's also been true in our individual lives. And I hope it continues to be true as we move forward. The positive aspects of the society we enjoy and take for granted are ours because when setbacks presented themselves, folks kept going. Some thought that the struggle for civil rights would end when JFK was assassinated. Many of you were alive then. You know what I'm talking about. But it kept going. When Martin Luther King Jr. was discouraged, when he faced his own mortality, when he was the most hated man in America, he kept going. So did his family and those in his inner circle. Some thought that the fight for civil rights would end when King was assassinated. But it's kept going. Some thought that the struggle would end when Bobby Kennedy, who was a fiercer advocate and far less pragmatic than his brother, was assassinated. But it also kept going after his death. There were many others who suffered and lost their lives, such as Malcolm X, but on June 5th, 1968, a song was written about these three in particular. Dick Holler wrote it the same day that Bobby Kennedy was killed. And towards the end of it, we hear these words: "Didn't you love the things that they stood for? Didn't they try to find some good for you and for me? And we'll be free someday soon. And it's going to be one day. These are words of heartbreak and, importantly, hope. We have setbacks. We've dealt with many. We're going to deal with more. But we keep going because we also have hope.